Explain to them why you're assigned to stick out a Category 5 out on a 20-foot sailboat in Tampa Harbor.
God told me to come out here and get a boat. I came out here and got a boat.
So the plan's just to stick it out here?
Yeah, safest place in the world to be is on my boat. I got room for one more female.
Move over, Lieutenant Dan, because there's another Lieutenant Dan, a real Lieutenant Dan. Well, not a veteran Lieutenant Dan, but he is a sailor that's missing a leg, and he's made quite a splash in the local news and in Florida. Boom! Meet Lieutenant Dan, Joseph Malinowski. Joseph John Malinowski, if I'm not mistaken. Now, you might recognize Lieutenant Dan from the viral videos on TikTok and Facebook and all over social medias, Twitter, too. I got you on Twitter there, Lieutenant. For being brave and some might say dumb enough to stay in Florida, in Tampa Bay, in his 20-foot, 22-foot sailboat during Hurricane Milton. People checking in on him during the hurricane was like, real life Anchorman Panda Watch. Except instead of a pregnant panda, it's seeing whether or not a single amputee man who looks as though he imbibes on the pipe, not judging, can stay alive in his boat that looks like it's made out of straw. And just like any viral video thing, personality, a little bit of controversy happened. Yeah, some controversy with Lieutenant Dan because people found out that he had a criminal history. Uh-oh, how bad is it? Some would say really bad. Some would say really, really bad. But then, just like M. Night Shyamalan, there's a twist. Before we go through this roller coaster of ups and downs that is the story and the waves, oddly enough, in the hurricane that Lieutenant Dan was trying to survive, and we will survive in this story. A word from this video sponsor. Hey, have you ever gotten the feeling that the media might be lying to you? Well, you'd be right. But if you want to find out by how much, you check out Ground News. For every story that's out there, Ground News gives you a quick visual breakdown on who's leaning left or right down the middle, or who's feeding you a line of crap. I'm talking about Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, the lot of them. You can compare news stories from one agency to the other, see which way they lean and who's giving you a line of bull. Wouldn't you want to know how accurate the news is that you're getting? You can also follow specific topics like, what the frig is going on in North Carolina? Is FEMA running out of money? Are we giving more money to Lebanon instead of our own people? I need to know. And Ground News will help you. And you'll get thousands of articles from both in the States and across the globe. Shine a light on media bias and hold everyone accountable. To check out and download Ground News yourself, check out the link below or go to groundnews.com/angrycops and get all the perks that Ground News has to offer. And you'll get 40% off if you want to subscribe. You're welcome. Let's start this thing off by meeting Lieutenant Dan. Here he is, I want to call him John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt because his name is so long. Joseph John Malinowski. Crazy last name, right? I mean, Joseph John, two first names, as a first and middle name. You would say it's unique.
You'd be wrong.
It is not a unique name.
What are the odds?
Fucking Polacks. Joe, also known as Lieutenant Dan, is no spring chicken. While others are fleeing Florida, he's staying put. Anchoring up, tying his boat off to one of the piers down there in Tampa Bay. I'm gonna say Tampa, I'm pretty sure it's Tampa, but it could be anywhere in Florida because Lieutenant Dan gets around. Now we all enjoy the Florida man, and what could be more Florida man than a man with an amputated leg staying on a 20-foot skiff in the middle of a hurricane saying, I suggest few things are as Florida man as Lieutenant Dan. And that's when things start getting crazy. Who is this man? Everybody's interested in Lieutenant Dan. What a unique nickname. We need to get this guy some money. Let's take care of Lieutenant Dan. Let's watch and see if Lieutenant Dan survives. But then if he does, we'll take care of Lieutenant Dan.
Why does that sound so familiar?
It's like a hurricane version of The Bachelorette. Except instead of a rose, you're given another day to live. Now here comes the ups and downs of this tale of Lieutenant Dan. You see, the internet is a strange place, and once you become, I will say, an icon, or at least a center of focus on the interwebs and social media, well, people go digging around and start snooping and start trying to figure out who you really are, or at least they try to paint a picture of who they think you are.
My source is that I made it the f*** up.
Based on that internet footprint that you've left behind. And unfortunately for Joseph John Malinowski, there are some people with some dirty prints that share the same name as good old Lieutenant Dan. Now, before people started snooping around too much, everybody wanted to give him a couple bucks, including a streamer a very well-known live streamer who I have to look up because I don't know him that well. Aiden Ross. I've heard of him before. Sorry, I don't know you, bud. Does he need a following or do I need... He's probably got way more followers than I do. Good for you, kid. Well, Aiden sees what's going on and says, you know what, I want to give this guy like 50 to 100,000 bucks to get a new boat, maybe even a Kick streaming deal, right? If you haven't heard of Kick, it's a streaming program similar to like Twitch or, YouTube Live, where you go on, you stream whatever's going on, cooking, cleaning, video games, you hanging out on a boat with your half of a leg trying to survive a hurricane, whatever you want. And your friends and subs that follow you can give you a couple bucks here and there, and you can start your own business just streaming and living life, and people will pay you to do it. Well, that sounds like fun. But let's not forget those internet sleuths while they came around after 1 or 2 Google searches and tried to tear down poor Joe. And listen, I'm not gonna lie, I was one of them. I made a response to somebody saying, hey, we should support this guy and give him a bunch of money and get him up on his feet. And I said, there's been some discovery stating that he might have touched some children. Might have given them some grape drink, if you understand what I'm saying. Now, because I got caught up in it. I was looking at a whole bunch of posts of just some random freaking people. Always do your due diligence on the internet. Don't, go on. Every time I want to say something smart ass and fast, I end up getting bit on the ass.
Simple detective work.
Sorry, Joe, from me to you. Now, I immediately went underneath my statement and said, hold on a second. There's more to this than what it seems. I could have made a mistake. Let me do a deep dive, and that's what we're doing here today. So let's dive a little deeper into what people thought was Lieutenant Dan's criminal past. Now, Joseph John Malinowski, like I said, not a common name, but I was wrong. There are several Joe Malinowskis, one of which lived in Illinois, who kidnapped and gave grape drink to a young girl and appears to still be in prison. Good. That guy should still be in prison for the rest of his life. Never, ever to see the light of day. Don't like people who touch kids. Not a good start. And another John Malinowski in Wisconsin, who ended up giving grape drink, grape-ifying his stepdaughter, and has since been released. Gross. This guy is gross. Bad person. But he's not Lieutenant Dan. And like a few people, I made that mistake right away, but I'm here to clear the air, Lieutenant Dan, and let you know that I'm sorry. You shouldn't have made that comment so quickly. Because Lieutenant Dan's done none of those things. Now, Lieutenant Dan does have a lot of mugshots, but what are they for? They're for traffic tickets. They're for buying a boat a year or two ago for $1, and, well, people who run the boat stuff down there, I'd assume it's their division of transportation or fish and wildlife, not sure, said, hey, how did you buy a boat for $1? Whose boat is this? Did you steal this boat? And then after their investigation, they dropped all the charges for that. So, traffic tickets? Okay. A boat that might not have been his, that he might have intentionally or accidentally sunk, that cost him $1. But then all the charges got dropped on that. All right, so that's gone. And then a strange charge of him trying to set a woman on fire. Now let me make this short and sweet. The story is that Lieutenant Dan was trying to get some junk off of some sort of park bench and used gasoline to try and get it off. Now, for those of you that are versed in, we'll say like commercial chemicals, you know that diesel or gas or straight alcohol can assist in removing stains or things that are stuck on or
Emotional damage.
basically it helps you clean sometimes. And well, some random Florida woman was walking by and said, hey, you can't be setting that bench on fire, to which Lieutenant Dan was like, off lady, I'm just trying to clean this thing off. To which she took as him trying to set her on fire. And let's say worst case scenario that he was gonna set the bench on fire. He didn't. And let's say that he tried to set the woman on fire and he like turned quickly and splashed some gasoline her way. Well, he didn't set her on fire. And the end result of that investigation, you ready for this? All charges dropped. And maybe some woman was being a little bit of a Karen when she saw Lieutenant Dan just doing some weird shit with some gasoline trying to get some stains off a bench. Who knows? Either way, nobody cares because the charges were dropped. Now here's the worst thing that Lieutenant Dan did. Lieutenant Dan got in a scuffle with a Florida cop. Punched him in the nose and the cop punched him right back. And Dan served like 6 months, between 6 months to a year for that. Listen, I don't like nobody getting in a fight with me and bopping me on the nose. 6 months to a year seems a little bit much. And, I know. Look at Dan. Look at Dan. How hard is he hitting you? Which foot does he have to lean into? Because he's only got one.
Well, you ain't got no legs, Lieutenant Dan.
To really give you a good bop on the nose. I think 6 months is fair. I think a year's a little much. Anywho, now that we've ironed that out, Lieutenant Dan isn't some weird kid toucher or diddler from Illinois or Wisconsin. He's just some guy that gets in vehicle and traffic trouble and finds boats and accidentally sinks them and has some crazy Karen come up to him and scream at him, and then he gets in a fight with a cop one time. Honestly, it sounds... Johnny Cash has done far worse than Lieutenant Dan, and he was a multimillionaire. And people loved Johnny Cash for being a little bit of a weirdo. I know I certainly do. But in the middle of these allegations of him touching people and his real criminal history coming back out, everybody was like, look at this man, he's a menace to society.
Think of the children. Won't somebody please think of the children?
Started yelling at Aiden Ross, the live streamer, and saying, you shouldn't give him any of that money. Now, I don't know Aiden Ross, and I do know Aiden Ross's response to that, and honestly, it would be similar to myself. I would tell those people, F off, I'm gonna do what I want with my money, and you can all suck a proverbial and watch me do whatever I want. With all due respect, take a long walk off of a short pier. Now, Ian Ross said, hey, listen, I wanted to get you a Kick live streaming deal, but Kick's really not into it. But screw it, I've got some money and I like you and I want to set you up for success, so I'm gonna help you buy a boat within that $100,000 range. And that is super nice of Aiden Ross. And guess what? Lieutenant Dan made it. Yeah, that's right. He lived through the storm. People were checking in on him while he was getting tipped and tossed around when they could. And the following day when the hurricane was over, they just popped on over and saw Lieutenant Dan there. And they asked him, Lieutenant Dan, what's the first thing you did after you got out your boat? And Lieutenant Dan had a fantastic response.
Smoked half a joint. I'm high. I'm watching all the people running around like crazy because of all the water.
Lieutenant Dan said, well, I shouldn't be saying this, but I sparked up a blunt and smoked it. Lieutenant Dan, he's like Popeye the Sailor Man, but for Florida Man. Popeye the Florida Man. So that's the whole spiel with Lieutenant Dan, the one-legged hurricane hero of Florida. Now, if you want to support this channel and the weird deep dives that I do on internet folk and policing and military life, well, then you go ahead and pick yourself up a shirt. I got Army Strong. Yeah. Moving sandbags 15 feet over that way. Why? I don't know. It's just what the Army told me to do. That's the best way to support the channel. By the way, Whoopi hoodies are back. I only have a couple hundred of them, so they sold out last year, and everybody's like, where's the Whoopi hoodies? Well, they're back, but there's not a lot of them, so pick them up, hurry up, get them before they're gone. And of course, if you enjoy the content and you want more and you want it uncensored, go over to Pepperbox. Yes, I'll always be uploading here on YouTube for free, but like I said, uncensored, longer versions, a little bit more back and forth. You go to Pepperbox and check it out. Cheapest way to support the channel is leave a comment. What you think about Lieutenant Dan? Did you get caught up in the he might have been a toucher and then found out he wasn't like I did? I made that mistake. Jeez, felt fucking stupid. Like the second I posted, I was like, shouldn't have done that. You should have looked into some of these stupid tweets from Bethany Regurgistan with 500 followers who just, God. Stupid private move. All right. See you next time, weirdos. His name is my name too. Whenever we go about, somehow he stays afloat. Joseph John Malinowski.